True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Jayne Leebrick met David Miller on January 1st, 1991, while she was on a cross-country flight from Florida to Los Angeles. He was in the seat next to her and seemed like the perfect man. Handsome, wealthy, and a brave cancer survivor, David really won her over. If David seemed too good to be true, that's because he was. Join us at the quiet end for Love Bombed, the seduction and murder of Jayne Miller. David swept Jayne off her feet, giving her expensive gifts and portraying himself as an important and powerful man. Within 6 weeks, the two were married. But from early on, Jayne's friends and family noticed that something wasn't right with David Miller. Jayne's dream man quickly turned into a nightmare, leaving Jayne in financial peril and eventually afraid for her life.
So this murder took place in Florida, and that gives us a Florida beer. I picked one from Motorworks Brewing in Bradenton. It's called Dysphotic. It's an old ale, 8.8% alcohol by volume. So up there a little bit, but not terrible. The beer is a clear garnet color with about a finger's worth of head. Nice aroma, grape, some sweet fruit, vanilla, and oak. Taste is wonderful. Grape, cherry, peach, vanilla, and oak. I know that sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But
it does, but I've actually had this beer before and I enjoyed it.
It's a medium-bodied beer, and I thought it was a delight to drink.
And it's really good to get away from Cigar City as much as we love it. You've done many of those.
I still got more.
Yeah, I know you do. Well, let's open this one up and have some. How's that?
Okay.
Okay, let's all go down to the quiet end and have our talk.
Yeah, it's starting to get ready for the holidays, getting decorated.
Yeah.
Although I notice there's more Christmas decorations than anything for Thanksgiving.
Oh yeah, Thanksgiving is pretty much skipped as far as that goes.
Yeah.
But I do like the lights in the bar are always pretty.
They are.
I like the simple white lights, really, are my preference.
Well, and we got our Santa friend who likes to finish out his day's work at the mall, sitting at the bar.
Sure.
Pouring a few down.
Oh yeah, I like to buy him a shot here and there. He deserves it. Boy. Just think of what his day was like.
I can't even begin.
No. Rough. A rough day.
So Jayne Miller found out that her husband was a bigamist on September 11th, 1991. That's just months after they were married.
So I kind of think of this as her own 9/11. It was really when her life fell apart and the beginning of the end for Jayne.
Well, her life had been falling apart before then anyway.
I guess so, but this is the big drop-off point.
It sure
when
was.
She found out that there was a second wife. That's a big deal.
Yeah, you could say so. So the Florida heat and humidity that day was pretty typical for that time of year. Jayne was oblivious to all this. Her mind was racing as she tried to understand all of the lies she'd been told by her so-called millionaire husband, who, as it happens, was still married to another woman.
Yeah, so this was really rough because, like you inferred, there was a lot going on before this that was very difficult for Jayne. So a few days later, early on September 15th, Jayne was driving alone toward her parents' house, which was in Sanford, Florida. Her heart was racing, and she made the drive at least 5 minutes faster than she normally would. And once she got there, she parked really haphazardly and marched right up the walkway to the front door. As she entered her parents' house, she told her father, Richard Leebrick, that she was done with David. It was over between them for good. So Jayne was pretty, 5'3" and blonde hair with big dark brown eyes. She just turned 33 that year, but her personal problems were really weighing on her. And her dad thought she'd aged a lot since marrying David Miller. There were just these new little wrinkles around her mouth and eyes. She just looked tired all the time. Jayne had a first and second marriage before this, and they had both ended in divorce, leaving her a single mother to her son Michael. But the loneliness and the responsibilities of being a single parent turned out to be nothing compared with the turmoil she'd been experiencing in this, her third marriage.
Yeah, David was a decent-looking 39-year-old guy. He had told Jayne that he had a multi-million-dollar savings account and a law degree. He seemed like he could be the knight in shining armor that Jayne had been waiting for her entire life. But after what seemed like a perfect 6 weeks of courtship, very brief engagement, wasn't it?
Yeah, 6 weeks. I know, you probably thought that those notes were in error and I meant 6 months. But no, it was 6 weeks.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Yeah, I could tell.
On reading.
Yeah, it's shocking, really.
So just barely into their marriage, really, David had begun to act strangely. Once they were married, David took impromptu and unexplained business trips, and he gave her these incredible explanations for his whereabouts. But Jayne was living on an emotional roller coaster and had more problems as David's wife than she'd ever had as a single parent.
So it's really easy in this story to blame Jayne and think, well, how could you believe this? But you have to think about where she was in her life. And this is her third marriage. She desperately wants it to work. And David also convinced a lot of other people about his lies, so she wasn't alone in this. Her father, Richard, was not surprised by his daughter's statement that she'd had it with him. He recognized that David was dishonest and shady. Jayne was not one to be taken advantage of, and Richard knew there was only so much she would take before walking away from David and this life of lies. But Richard really had no idea how bad things were with David. He had long since stopped believing David's lies, but fighting back tears, Jayne told her dad that David actually had another wife. Not an ex-wife, a current wife. So Richard really felt for his daughter, but in truth he wasn't completely shocked. Jayne had made some poor choices, especially when it came to men, but she'd always been strong enough to walk away from a toxic relationship. Jayne's problem, he felt, was that she was always too trusting. Jayne soon composed herself and told her dad that she was going to move back to L.A. She'd be pressing charges against David and getting revenge for how he had used her and deceived her. Now, Richard believed that David had been dishonest and acting strangely since he'd even known him. But then lately he'd worried that David could actually be dangerous. Despite his concerns, Richard felt that his daughter was strong and resilient, and she'd be okay in the long run. She'd move back to L.A. and start her life over again. Jayne had even contacted a private investigator, and she was planning to meet with him again the next day. So Jayne said to Richard, "I won't rest until he's behind bars for this, but there's something I have to do first." And then she stood up and walked to the telephone.
Yeah, David still had belongings in Richard's storage unit, and she was going to put them outside. She had left a message for David the night before, telling him what she was going to do. As she picked up the telephone to call David again, Jayne yelled into the phone, leaving a message on David's answering machine, telling him that he had 8 hours to pick up his junk, or she was going to have it hauled off to the dump. Fighting words.
Yeah, she felt empowered at this point. But I think she kind of underestimated this man. After hanging up the phone, Jayne told both of her parents not to worry about her. Richard had just told Jayne's mom what was going on, and she was very shocked. She was even more worried about Jayne than her husband had been. Jayne told them that she was leaving, and her mom told her not to go see David, but Jayne told her not to worry. She said she'd be long gone from the storage facility when David got there. Jayne blew her parents a kiss before walking briskly out their front door. She knew David better than they did, and she believed that he was no longer the confident, self-centered narcissist he had been. He was a broken man, and in her opinion, he was no longer a threat to her, and this was where she made a mistake. And for this reason, she had no intention of avoiding David. She would return his belongings, but only after she could look him in the face and tell him all about her plans to destroy him. He had lied to her, causing her deep emotional pain, and he had humiliated her. Now she would relish the look on his face when she told him about her plans to press charges for bigamy against him.
Yeah, but what Jayne didn't understand about David Miller was that he was a sociopath. Years before Jayne drove away from her parents' house, plotting revenge against him, David had given himself permission to do whatever he needed or wanted to. He had discovered the thrill of lying early in his life and ignored warnings that telling one lie leads to telling two, and so on. David was quite skilled at lying, but as his lies built up, he was forced to live a life of absolute deceit. At least in his mind, Jayne was a threat to the life he had built for himself.
Yeah, so let's go back a little bit and learn more about Jayne and David and how things even got to this point. Clearly, David Miller had a long history of deceit against more than one woman who just wanted to be loved and have a happy, comfortable life. As a child, David was happy. He liked playing cops and robbers and baseball and other games with the other neighborhood boys. But as he reached adolescence, David began spending a lot of his time away from home. When his father, Russell, would ask him where he had been or what he'd been doing, his answers would be very short and vague. His younger sister, Diana, would say that David didn't exactly lie back then, but there were a lot of things that he did keep to himself. Back then, David probably didn't really have anything to hide. He wasn't breaking any laws, and he wasn't getting into trouble. He didn't drink or take drugs, and he didn't have any run-ins with the law. David was just too busy to explain what he was doing to his parents. So most kids his age might have been in one club or one or two sports teams, but David was involved in dozens of activities all at the same time. He was active with the town's boys' club, and he was the scorekeeper for several sports teams at his high school. Although his parents worried about when David would have time to study and get his homework done, he nearly always brought home great report cards. If his parents were confused about what caused David to keep himself so busy, David's friends understood that he could not tolerate boredom at all. And in the town where he grew up, Sardis, Ohio, boredom was really easy to come by. Sardis was a small town located along the Ohio River. It was so rural that David and his siblings were born in a hospital in West Virginia because that was the closest one. But Sardis was a really lovely town with many nice people living there. But to David, it was like a prison. David graduated from high school in 1968, and 2 months later, when he turned 18, he packed up and moved 60 miles southwest to a dormitory in Athens, Ohio. He attended classes at Ohio University. Before long, David began practicing his life's occupation of deception. David found freedom in being whomever he wanted to be. He found it thrilling. He was able to develop a fascinating identity, and he used this skill at lying to impress women who probably otherwise wouldn't have given him a second look.
In college, David wasn't the only guy who stretched the truth in order to impress his peers, but in time most of them outgrew the need to lie. And under other circumstances, David Miller might also have outgrown this. But he was just so good at it. It worked for him. So he really embraced it.
He really did.
After he began lying, David realized that people trusted him easily. He had a gentle, placid voice that seemed genuine. By his sophomore year, David had found the perfect way to use his talent for twisting the truth. Politics.
Yeah.
He won a low-level office in student government, and he was able to have pull in dozens of university organizations. Over the next few years, his college political career involved him in the lives of students from all over the school. Athletes liked to hang out with him, theater students liked him, girls were attracted to him, and even academic standouts wanted to be his friend. David was popular beyond any of his expectations.
After leaving Ohio University, David wouldn't forget that politics had given him his first brush with being the popular guy. In David's eyes, politicians were like superstars. They could say and do whatever they wanted, and there were no notable repercussions. But more than the popularity that came from politics, David loved power. For that reason, there was never any doubt in his mind that that's where he would focus his career. So in 1973, David moved to Washington, D.C. During his first few weeks, he spent evenings walking the streets near Capitol Hill and down Pennsylvania Avenue. To him, there really was no bigger thrill than to be a senator or a congressman or even president of the United States. Back then, he thought the sky was the limit. While David spent his evenings dreaming about having political power, he spent his days trying to make this a reality. So he took a job as a researcher for a congressman and was able to convince dozens of people in Washington that he was next in line for that position. One of those people was a young woman with political ambitions of her own, and she was impressed with David's energy and really enjoyed the stories that he told about his powerful, wealthy relatives, which wasn't true, of course. They began dating, and in 1975 they were married. David developed what was later known as the Wall. This was in his modest office in D.C., and it was a showcase of photos of David standing next to different prominent political people. David managed to accumulate these photos by taking a camera with him to every political function that he attended, and there were many. He would work his way over to the most influential people in the room, start up a conversation, and then ask them if they minded having their picture taken with him. So David ended up with an impressive number of pictures on the wall by the end of his third year. There were framed photos of himself with various congressmen, senators, and even foreign statesmen. But David's most prized possession on the wall was a picture of himself with President Gerald Ford. He would use these photos to back up his numerous fictional stories about being part of the powerful Washington elite. So less than 2 years went by before David's wife became tired of these lies. His marriage fell apart, and since they had no children and little property to divide up, their divorce was pretty simple.
In 1978, in search of a new place to develop his many and sometimes scattered ambitions, David moved to Los Angeles and lived in the San Fernando Valley. Long before he moved, he researched the area's politics, and what he learned was that Los Angeles politics was competitive and very much in the public eye, but the Valley was a less visible political arena. Valley residents were also more trusting of their representatives. Their positions seemed too minor to criticize. The Valley was still part of Los Angeles, but its reduced visibility made it the ideal place for David to start over. And maybe more importantly, the Valley had people there who he'd never lied to before, women he'd never met or tried to hook up with before.
Yeah, so kind of a fresh start.
Very. Had to have been exciting for him.
I bet it was. And in the San Fernando Valley, David found political opportunities. There were dozens of jobs that he felt capable of getting. Positions with city council representatives, congressmen, assemblymen, and senators. One problem was that in the Valley's small political circle, the politicians all knew one another. So to be included, David considered political lobbying. And the longer he thought about it, the better idea it seemed to be. In his opinion, a lobbyist position would move him beyond the Valley's circle and into the paths of politicians that actually ran the state of California. So in late 1978, David took a job lobbying for the state's printing industry. David seemed too good to be true, as he took to his new position brilliantly. In just weeks, the job took over every part of David's life. Those who worked with him saw him to be a man who was really devoted to the rules and regulations regarding the printing industry. He seemed like someone who was dedicated to seeing the industry thrive in the future. But David's real motive likely had nothing to do with a love of printing. He made himself available at every political function in hopes of making a name for himself, because that's all it was about. So as part of this, he began to update his image. He bought an expensive designer wardrobe and began wearing his black hair in a new fashionable haircut. Using what seemed to be a sudden windfall of cash, David contacted various charities and offered up significant donations. So he was making money as a lobbyist. He was able to pledge thousands of dollars to political fundraisers and once gave $10,000 to the California State University at Northridge for its School of Education. So midway through that year, David bought a brand new Jaguar with vanity license plates that read Advocate. He became involved with the Granada Hills Chamber of Commerce in the northern San Fernando Valley, and he quickly became president of that organization. He chaired various valley committees and became acquainted with a lot of powerful businessmen in that area. So things really seemed to be going his way.
So David was seen as a highly paid lobbyist who was doing his part to see that legislation favored the state's printers. But there were those who wondered if David's apparent financial success was related to his connections with a certain senator, because some of the senator's practices could be described as questionable.
Questionable, yeah, at least. I think they bordered on the criminal or
Maybe
even went over
illegal.
that line. Absolutely.
So several times each month, when his lobbying work took him to the state's capital in Sacramento, David would work out of that senator's office. Now, David was supposed to be working as a lobbyist and just using the senator's office for convenience. But when investigators indicted the senator on charges including extortion and the fraudulent use of tax money, David cut ties with the senator. He began working from the office of another senator. This one had even more questionable practices. So in the early 80s, that senator was indicted on similar charges as the first senator. David then began occasionally working from the office of Senator Allen Robbins. Robbins was the most influential of the three senators that David had befriended. He was well liked by the public and seemed to have a great political future ahead of him. But he too succumbed. 1991, Robbins was indicted, charged with crimes including the misuse of funds.
Right, so basically people thought he had more to do with this. He'd really involved himself with senators who soon afterward ended up indicted. So a theory began to circulate among some people who knew David. The theory was that those senators needed someone to carry out illegal activities without being easily traced, and David fit that bill. For his job, a lobbyist could make thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this would have explained David's ability to spend large amounts of money. But there was never proof of any relationship like that between David and the senators. So each time a senator fell from public grace, David wasn't even questioned about it. So he was never publicly suspected of any wrongdoing. So David was surprisingly very successful with women, too. People expected to see him out with beautiful, intelligent women. But David had his own understanding of women. He believed they were gullible and willing to comply with his desires as long as he would spend money on them. So he didn't respect most of the women he dated. He might tell a woman that he came from a wealthy New England family whose fortune included millions of dollars in property, but others might be told he was part of a royal European family. Then there were some women who reacted best when he made up stories to gain their sympathy. For them, David would say he was dying of cancer and just doing his best to enjoy life in the time that he had left.
David was non-committal with all of the women he dated. That was until he met Dorothy Garofalo in 1979. Dorothy was 31 years old. She was a beautician, and she owned C'est Chic, an expensive beauty shop in Encino, California. She had a steady, wealthy clientele. Dorothy was recently divorced. She had a daughter and 2 sons. David met her at her salon one day after he arrived in a limo, looking like a real bigwig. "Hi, beautiful," he said. "I'm David Miller. Is there someone who could give me a manicure?"
So kind of cheesy, I think he was.
Well,
But, Dorothy fell for it.
obviously.
The whole time that David was getting his fingernails done, Dorothy felt self-conscious. She found herself looking in David's direction over and over, wondering who he was and why she felt so attracted to him. He was handsome enough, but he wasn't striking to look at like some of her other clients. But he had all of her attention that day. When David walked up to the counter and took out his credit card and paid, Dorothy looked up and blushed. He flirted with her, and he made another appointment for the following week. Until he'd met Dorothy, David had no intention of letting any woman see him as he really was. He prided himself on being able to lie to people and use them for his own benefit. He definitely felt more for Dorothy than he had for the other women he'd dated and used. After seeing her for a short time, he decided to take things one day at a time and see how it went. If he fell in love with her, he would tell her whatever it took just to keep her, but he would never tell her about how he really made his money. He wouldn't let anyone in his political circle know about his relationship with her either, so that was a strange thing.
Quite.
So dating David brought excitement into Dorothy's life. She'd never been happier in her life, and she attributed every bit of her happiness to David Miller. The question of David's employment came up early in their relationship. He had already told Dorothy that he was in business, but after only a few dates, she wanted to know more about him. Then he told her a story that he had rehearsed. My business represents clients who have difficulty accessing certain files of communication that are necessary for them to be successful. So that's a little bit convoluted.
Well, I was going to say it sounds like bullshit.
It kind of does. But he said that he wasn't an attorney himself, but he employed attorneys and oversaw the legal processes. So for the time, that did seem to satisfy her. After all, he looked like he had plenty of money.
Well, he acted like he had plenty of money.
He did, and he could spend money back then because he was making money as a lobbyist. Finally, less than a year after that first date, David suggested that they move in together. And Dorothy wasn't sure she liked that idea because she'd been raised to believe that living together before marriage was a sin. But they had been spending several nights a week in each other's beds anyway, and David could be very convincing. He charmed her with the idea of waking up together and sharing breakfast every morning. So she finally agreed, and the two rented a 3-bedroom house in Granada Hills, which is a very nice community on the north side of the San Fernando Valley. What Dorothy didn't know was that David had been planning to move in with her all along, and just as he'd hoped, Dorothy had not questioned his explanations about his private business, and she seemed content with the sketchy details he would dole out to her. He knew that she didn't doubt him at all.
And after nearly a year of dating Dorothy, not one of his co-workers or political contacts knew about their relationship. There was one problem. The salon Dorothy owned had been recommended to him by one of his political contacts. For that reason, it was possible that someone could find out about his relationship with Dorothy. So to eliminate that possibility, he convinced her to sell the salon. Now, I'm not sure what difference it would make.
If people found out about her?
Yeah.
Well, he wanted to date. That's what it was. He wanted to publicly date other women. Can't do that if you have a wife or a live-in girlfriend that people know about. They would frown on that. So after several months of living on David's income, Dorothy finally opened another salon, which was several miles away from where her original salon had been. Once her new place was established and David was sure that none of his political friends knew who she was, he was able to relax. By then, David had already had several affairs with other women, and the idea of living one life with Dorothy and another when he left home each day was really thrilling for David. He felt like he had more than any of the men whose position he had envied, so it gave him this feeling of winning. Even the governor of the state didn't have 2 lives. He felt like he was the only one who could pull this off so flawlessly.
1 year after moving in with Dorothy, David changed up his political career. He felt stuck in his position as a lobbyist for the printing industry, so he quit his job and opened his own lobbying office. After more than a year of telling Dorothy that he made a living operating his own business, David was now doing that, for real. David's clients were business owners and representatives of different industries. He would meet with them, show them his resume and portfolio, told them stories about politicians that made most of them sound like close personal friends.
Well, and that's where those pictures came in handy.
You bet. They would then give David tens of thousands of dollars because of his political connections, in hopes that he could make an impact on future legislation. He was nominated and elected president of the Granada Hills Chamber of Commerce, and he became a prominent member of the United Chambers of Commerce in the San Fernando Valley. He began to travel several times a month. Dorothy was unhappy. Her new salon was not nearly as successful as the one that David had convinced her to sell.
Well, David could see that Dorothy was becoming disillusioned with their life together, and even suspicious that he was cheating on her. So he decided to tell her that he was in the CIA. His business career had been a cover, he said, and whenever he was away, he was actually doing dangerous secret missions for the government. He was telling her now, he said, because he was being followed, and for the safety of him, her, and their children, because she had children, they needed to move. The truth was that David had wanted to buy a house with Dorothy for a while, and that he had wanted to marry her eventually. And now they had no choice but to move, and he knew Dorothy would agree that their money should be put to better use by buying a home together. He had already found a house near his office in Granada Hills, and he had already talked with a real estate agent. So Dorothy had 2 young boys and a daughter who was about 9, I think, when they got married.
Yeah.
So according to David, the terrorists wanted to make a move on him sometime in February or March. So as long as they were out of that apartment, within 3 months, they'd be safe. Dorothy was really upset by this because she believed it. She was crying. But David was elated with how well he was pulling off this lie. Dorothy began volunteering to combine finances, and she did most of the legwork for the move. She had to because David said he had an important mission that was coming up in Nicaragua.
Yeah, David boarded a plane later that month that was not destined for Nicaragua. Instead, it was taking him to Miami Beach, Florida, where he would board a cruise ship the next day. Back at home, Dorothy took time off of work to organize their move while she worried about her CIA agent husband.
So it's just really a stretch for anyone to believe the CIA story. So he must have been a really good liar.
Well, I don't know about 1991, but these days, if you use that as a cover...
Well, this was the 80s when he got together with Dorothy because he met Jayne in 1991.
That's right. I got confused with wives.
Well, I bet it's easy for that to happen.
But the point was that, I can't tell you what I'm doing because I'm in the CIA.
Yeah.
Just a pile of crap.
Yeah, I guess in the 80s maybe it wasn't such a cliche to say that. Seems like a bad movie plot to me, though.
It does.
But for Dorothy, David brought more happiness in her life than she'd ever imagined possible, at least early on, because when he was home, he spent time with her sons, Michael and Tony. The boys had been toddlers when she and David began living together, and by 1981, both boys were calling him Daddy. Although they still saw their father on a regular basis, they really loved David. But her daughter Katie was hesitant about David's role in their lives. She was 9 years old by then, and she was the only one of Dorothy's children who was old enough to really remember living with their real father. So Katie was very cool toward David. But when David returned from his trip to Miami 2 weeks later, Dorothy had the new house all furnished and set up for him. He was tan, and he told her stories of how rough his trip had been. Then he told her he'd be going away again in 4 days. So he was loving this, and David and Dorothy's lives continued pretty much this way for the next 4 years. Each time he needed to attend a political function, or if he just wanted some time away with another woman, he just told Dorothy he was going on another mission. And as far as she knew, he was in Chile, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Iran, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. And each time, he brought her a postcard of the place where his mission had been, which I guess was supposed to make it more believable, but a postcard isn't a lot.
No.
But of course, it was secret. So the only thing David would tell her about his local workplace was that it was about 20 miles from their house. Dorothy knew that Los Angeles was about that far, so she figured he worked somewhere downtown. David told her, of course, that the location of the office was top secret, and if David didn't want her to know its whereabouts, she wasn't going to snoop. But really, David was just working less than a mile away from their house.
Right around the corner.
Pretty close, yeah.
So David proposed to Dorothy, and when he suggested Las Vegas for the wedding, she agreed it would be the perfect place. They could get married without the complications of a big ceremony and start their honeymoon as soon as the ceremony was over. When they told Dorothy's 3 children, Katie stormed out of the room angrily. This was the first time Dorothy heard a coolness and anger in David's voice, which she didn't like.
Yeah, as the years passed, Katie's dislike for David only grew. He never mistreated her until one day when she came home from school to find David home early from work. She'd been wearing a new outfit, and during recess, she'd ripped a hole in a pants leg. And David noticed the rip as soon as she walked in, and he yelled at her. Then when she made a sarcastic comment back at him, he grabbed her by the arm and threw her to the floor. So it seems like he was angry that she'd caught him at home when he was supposed to be at work. and that's what set him off. And when Dorothy returned home that evening, Katie was in her room crying. But David got to Dorothy first, and when Dorothy went to see her daughter, she ended up scolding Katie and, pretty much taking David's side, which really hurt Katie.
Oh, sure it did. So at first the altercations between David and Katie rarely occurred. But by the time Katie was 12, David was often angry with Katie. Katie became more withdrawn. Occasionally she would complain that David was hurting her or treating her badly, but Dorothy always heard David's point of view first, and she believed that Katie was at fault. Eventually Katie stopped looking to her mother for help and began to hide her feelings.
That's very sad just to think about what that girl went through. I've been a 12-year-old girl, and it really sucks, and being in that kind of situation would just make it worse.
Wouldn't it?
Yeah. So in November of 1988, David came home from one of his missions, and he told Dorothy that something terrible had happened. Terrorists knew where they lived now, and the government wanted them to move to Florida. He said they had no choice because they were all in danger. So of course Dorothy was really upset and felt she had no choice but to move.
After a senator who David was working with was indicted, he branched out on his own and took on a business partner. David's finances became sketchy, and the partner grew suspicious. But then David told his partner that he had cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy. Using this excuse and claiming to have less than a year to live, David was able to get money from his partner as well as from other people.
Yeah, he said he needed help paying for the chemotherapy.
It's expensive stuff,
Well, right. And in Florida, David wasn't bringing in the large amounts of money that he'd really gotten used to. He had to fly across the country several times a month, and he had to pay these travel expenses out of his own pocket. So he did begin to feel anxious about his ability to continue living this double life. And there was something else that was beginning to worry David. Since moving Dorothy and the children to Florida, it turned out he had less time to have fun. By August of 1989, he was really losing the lifestyle he'd loved, and Katie was nearly 17 now and hated David. Each time he was home between missions, they argued a lot. Katie believed David hated her and that he was trying to ruin her life, and inevitably, Dorothy became upset about the rift. Katie filed at least 2 complaints with the state of Florida, charging David with child abuse. Both times a caseworker was assigned to investigate these charges, and both times the director of Florida's Protective Services System decided that Katie's complaints were unfounded. There was no real evidence of abuse. So Katie ended up running away to LA, and eventually she moved in with her father. Of course, Dorothy was upset by this, but David was able to convince her that this was for the best.
So David was dating several women who had money. I'll bet he researched financial aspects of the women he dated.
Oh, sure, because Dorothy and Jayne were both pretty successful. He didn't want anyone that was going to depend on him too much, and, he was able to get money from them by telling that terminal cancer story.
Yeah, whatever works.
Absolutely. Early in the morning of New Year's Day, 1991, David drove himself to the airport in Orlando, and he boarded a plane back to L.A. He had shared a wonderful Christmas with Dorothy and the 2 boys. Because of the numerous loans he'd received from friends and lovers, he'd been able to be generous with his gift-giving, and he still had more than $10,000 in his pocket. So even though it was kind of short-sighted, he was feeling pretty good. And as he sat in the plane, a woman tapped him on his shoulder. It was Jayne Leebrick. He was in her seat, so he moved over to the seat beside her so she could sit down. David found her very attractive, and they spent the flight talking, mostly about him and how successful he was.
A bit of background on Jayne. She was born in Virginia on March 4th, 1958. Jayne had had a happy childhood. She, her sisters, and her brother were raised by parents who doted on them, but in 1975, when Jayne was 17 years old, she became involved with a guy named Jake, who she'd met at school. The two became physical very quickly, and Jayne told her parents that they were deeply in love. Her parents tried to slow down the relationship, but Jayne and Jake were just head over heels.
Yeah, so maybe they shouldn't have been too surprised when Jayne became pregnant, but they all were. Over the next 8 years, Jayne married Jake, divorced Jake, married again, and divorced again. She began new relationships full of hope, but then each time she was left disappointed. But Jayne didn't become bitter or disillusioned with love. Jayne had earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, and she had worked hard to support herself and her son. She advanced in her career and was earning $65,000 a year before bonuses. Now this was a long time ago, so that was a lot of money. That was over $200,000 in today's money. Eventually, Jayne got tired of dating and she began avoiding most opportunities to do so. For Christmas of 1990, Jayne went to see her parents in Florida, and that's how she'd ended up on the same plane as David Miller, flying back from Florida to LA.
After the flight, Jayne was excited about David. Of course, he had told her that he was single. He had also told her that he was a successful businessman, a millionaire, and a cancer survivor. Jayne called her best friend and told her all about the wonderful man she'd met on the flight. He inherited $14 million from his father's business, and then he was diagnosed with cancer. But the cancer was gone now. When he found out about the cancer, he took a year and traveled the world. He spent $10 million, but he still had the rest in bank accounts and investments.
For the next 3 weeks, David dated Jayne. He took her to expensive restaurants, bought her a gold bracelet and matching necklace, had bouquets of roses delivered to her work, and even used a limousine service on a regular basis for their dates. They saw each other at least every other day, and Jayne had never been happier. She was really impressed to learn that he had worked for former President Richard Nixon as a Spanish interpreter for foreign relations. David really seemed to be a brilliant man, and he seemed to be falling in love with Jayne as much as she was with him. He was spending less time on his business, though, and he was quickly running out of money. But he figured he could borrow more money if necessary, and he could start using his credit. In the days when he'd had much more money, David had established an extensive line of credit, and thus far he hadn't had to use his credit cards very much. But he was doing a lot of traveling back and forth from Florida in order to keep Dorothy from getting suspicious. He told Jayne that he was an attorney, and so far he hadn't given Jayne any reason to question why an attorney would have to spend so much time away from his office. David knew that he would have to be away from Dorothy even more than before if he wanted to continue being with Jayne. But the war in the Middle East gave him the perfect excuse. After such a war, there could potentially be cleanup missions that might continue for years and years afterwards. So that gave him a lot of stuff to talk about, a lot of reasons to be away.
Yeah, within 5 weeks of meeting her, David proposed to Jayne. The idea that marrying Jayne would make him a bigamist apparently didn't bother him. Maybe in his mind, a man was a bigamist only if people found out that he had 2 wives, and David did not intend that to ever happen. He knew that he was good at keeping secrets.
Well, so far in his life, it seems like he'd gotten away with pretty much everything.
Oh, he has.
So he probably didn't think he'd ever be found out. Unlike his relationship with Dorothy, David decided not to hide Jayne from his business and political contacts. So after the engagement, David spent time introducing his fiancée to his associates. He even took her to his office and pointed out the sign on the door that read David Miller and Associates. He introduced her to his secretaries and to his business partner. Friend and business partner Ed C. had been surprised when David said he had met a woman and wanted to introduce her to everyone. David was supposed to be dying of cancer, his partner thought, and was suffering from effects of chemotherapy. So he wondered how had David met, dated, and proposed to someone so quickly when he was dying of cancer. Just didn't make sense. So I think Ed was probably one of the first people to get suspicious.
On February 16th, 1991, with her best friend Jody standing beside her, Jayne became David's second wife. Actually, third wife.
Well, second at one time.
Okay.
Right. We're not counting exes. We're just counting current.
I see.
So she's his second current wife.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were married in the We've Only Just Begun wedding chapel in Las Vegas. Quaint name.
Yeah.
After a lifetime of disappointing relationships, Jayne felt like David was the man she had been looking for. She was thrilled with David's old-fashioned ideals and how he wanted to include her family in their new life together. And while David was exchanging wedding vows with Jayne, Dorothy sat at home wondering when he would be home from his latest mission.
And no doubt worrying about him.
Well, sure.
After David and Jayne had been married for 1 week, he began to realize a few of the flaws in having 2 wives. He'd been back to visit Dorothy for a 2-day trip, and he'd spent the whole time worrying that he was running out of both time and money. By telling Jayne he was traveling for business when he was actually traveling to see Dorothy, he was leaving himself no time for any real business travel. And as a result, his business began to fail. Even longtime clients who had trusted his lobbying efforts for years were beginning to cancel their deals with David. And this is when things really started to fall apart. Even though he was living 2 separate lives, he was still only one man, and he didn't have time for everything. Because of the failing business, David was in worse financial trouble than he'd ever been in. He had tried to borrow money from some friends who still believed he was dying of cancer, but eventually they were unable to loan him the amount of money he needed. So his situation was becoming desperate. That's when he decided to tell Jayne that they needed to move to Florida. That way at least he wouldn't have to travel so far between wives. They'd both be in the same state. So now when he actually did travel, he could be traveling for his business, bringing in money and contracts. Getting Jayne to move to Florida was the perfect plan, he decided, and he told Jayne that he was tired of politics and that he had accepted an offer from Orlando's Disney Studios to work for them as an in-house attorney. "No, Jayne, I don't need the money," he said, but he had always wanted the challenge of representing a big corporation like Disney. It was really a chance of a lifetime, he told her. Now, Jayne's parents, Richard and Janice, really weren't thrilled about their daughter's decision to marry a man she'd only known for 6 weeks. Can't blame them. They had no real reason to dislike David yet, but Jayne had already had 2 failed marriages in less than 10 years. So Jayne's parents thought their daughter should probably spend at least a year getting to know a man before she married him. But when they had separately voiced their concerns to Jayne, she told them David was different. He wasn't like the other guys.
Well, that's what she said to you folks.
That's what she said.
So when Jayne called to tell her parents about David's offer to take the entire family to Europe in the summer, Richard became suspicious. He and his wife agreed to the trip. Jayne's son Michael would go as well. But Richard was less interested in Europe than he was in getting to know his new son-in-law. That would happen in just weeks when the newlyweds moved to Florida. Before Jayne and David were scheduled to arrive in Florida and begin house hunting, Richard called another of his daughters. She had worked for an attorney in the past and had access to information from Florida's Bar Association. David said he'd graduated from Georgetown University Law School, and that was something that could be verified. Richard's instincts told him that David was a liar.
So when the couple had been in Florida for less than 2 full days, Jayne called to tell her parents that they'd found a house. Richard agreed to meet them at the property, and he took down directions from Jayne over the phone. As he realized the location of the house, Richard wondered if David really was a millionaire after all. The new house was in Heathrow, an upper-class area with very expensive houses that were built on several acres each. These are basically mansions. And when Richard arrived at the house, he was impressed. This house was brand new and it was still vacant. From the outside, it appeared to be at least 3,000 square feet, and the grounds were just landscaped beautifully. So Richard stayed and watched as David worked out the details of the purchase with the real estate agent. David promised to transfer the necessary funds into a newly opened checking account in Florida, and after that he would get a cashier's check for the purchase price, and the title to the house would be transferred to his name. Richard had to admit that David did seem to be a man of his word. So far, he'd really given no reason for Richard to doubt him. Still, Richard wasn't convinced, and he wondered what his other daughter was finding out about David's legal background.
Then the very next day, Jayne called her father and said that there had been a glitch in the paperwork involving their new home. And because of this, they would have to rent an apartment for a month or so until the details could be worked out. But in the meantime, they were going to buy furniture. During the next few days, with David scheduled to begin work at Disney the following week, Jayne and David spent hours purchasing furniture for their new home. David had told her that money was no object, and she should buy whatever she liked.
Yeah, so when she was finished, Jayne had picked out everything except for the window treatments and a few accessories. She had chosen enough furniture to make their new home comfortable. The price of this was over $11,000, including fees for delivery and assembly of the furniture in the new home in Heathrow. But 1 week later, David was supposedly spending his first full day at Disney Studios, and Jayne was at the apartment going over a list of the furniture that they had purchased. That's when her sister called their father Richard with news about her research. "You were right, Dad," she said sadly. "David isn't a lawyer. Not here and not in California either. They've never heard of him." So Richard asked, well, what about Georgetown University? But there was no record of David there either. So after that conversation, Richard called Jayne and told her what he'd found out. "Listen, Jayne," he said, "David's a fraud and a liar. You've got to get away from this guy." But Jayne didn't like what she was hearing. She was in love. She was happy. She wanted to give her husband the benefit of explaining himself before she came to any conclusions about him. So she thanked her dad for calling, and Richard could tell she was angry with him for checking out David. She told her dad, "I'm sure David will be able to explain the entire thing." So Jayne called David and asked him to see his new office at Disney. And somehow he managed to bring her to an office there the next day, and he showed her an office with his name on the desk. This relaxed her. She even felt bad for doubting him. But during this time, Dorothy rarely saw David. He tried to soothe her worries and pacify her, but Dorothy was getting tired and very skeptical of what he was telling her. He was just spending so much time with Jayne. So they ended up having the biggest argument they'd had since they'd been together. And after this argument between David and Dorothy, David packed his things and returned to the apartment that he shared with Jayne. She'd thought he had left immediately after work for a business trip to L.A., so when David came home at 8 o'clock that evening, he told Jayne that the trip had been canceled, and Jayne was just happy to have him home. Dorothy had started to make a life for herself outside of her relationship with David. She made new friends, and she spent time with her neighbors. Sometimes she wondered why they had stayed married so long when they spent so little time together. In the past, when she would become frustrated by his traveling, she would think about the danger that David faced as a CIA agent, and she'd feel sorry for him. But the idea of feeling sorry for her husband was really getting old. He didn't seem to miss her the way that he once had, and he really called her rarely. But it seemed like David had completely forgotten about their earlier argument. He was looking forward to taking a cruise with Jayne in the Bahamas, and Dorothy was just out of his mind. David and Jayne hadn't had a proper honeymoon, he told her, and it was time they took a vacation by themselves. And Jayne was really excited by the idea of a vacation.
And when they returned from the cruise, David began to worry about having two wives living in the same town.
Yeah, you wonder why he didn't think about that earlier.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, even in a fairly large city, you run in similar circles.
Well, sure, you could just run into them anywhere around town.
Very likely.
But what he did was he worked out a plan, and he drove over to Dorothy in tears. He told her that there were death threats against her and the children, and the only solution was for her to move. And for whatever reason Dorothy believed him, he seemed very convincing. So this time they'd be moving to Pennsylvania. Dorothy's parents lived there, and he said he wanted them to be close to family. So basically, he's just gotten Dorothy out of the way. And the very next day, with only a few suitcases filled with her clothing, Dorothy, David, and her sons left for Pennsylvania. When Dorothy asked David why the Secret Service men hadn't followed them to the airport like he said that they would, he just assured her that they had. "That's why they're Secret Service men," he said, and smiled. "Even I don't know when they're following me." Dorothy felt thankful to have gotten her family away without any of them being heard. She only hoped that no one would find them at their new home in Pennsylvania. When they arrived, David spent the next 2 days setting Dorothy and her sons up in a small apartment and spending some time with Dorothy's parents. "Take care of her while I'm gone," he said. David had sensed that Dorothy's parents were not easily fooled, and he'd never given them the CIA story. But he did tell them that he worked with the security of the country and that he was moving Dorothy because he loved her and wanted her to have their support. David's plan of having Dorothy and Jayne live in that same city so that he could have more time to travel for business had really backfired. He still had to spend time in Los Angeles to keep the business going, and he had been forced to turn down one trip after another. Valuable connections he'd spent years developing were disappearing, and his financial situation was beyond desperate. In 1 month, he had run up his credit card accounts to between $15,000 and $20,000. He had no idea how he was going to pay these bills when they began to come in. But by then, his only concern was that he keep his recent credit purchases from Dorothy. Didn't want her to find out. He'd hoped that she wouldn't receive the statements because of their sudden move to Pennsylvania. But after the move, Dorothy had contacted the credit card companies, and she'd notified them of her change of address. So David would have to intercept the statements. He must have phoned the credit card companies and asked the exact date that they intended to mail their statements. That way, he would have learned when the bills might arrive at Dorothy's new apartment in Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Jayne and David planned to move into their new house in Heathrow in mid-April. The furniture, which had been put on a credit card, had been put in storage. David had even hired movers to transfer their new belongings into the house as soon as they closed on it. But David really couldn't have intended to buy that home with cash. He put off the real estate agent by promising to pay the purchase price as soon as he could clear the funds from his investment accounts. In the meantime, he continued to work on bringing in new lobbying clients. That way he could eventually put down several $1,000s to hold the house and then hopefully get a mortgage from a local bank. At this point, everyone David had borrowed money from was worried about getting paid back, and calls from these people were a constant distraction. So David really had been unable to get back into the groove as a lobbyist. So then, during the early part of April, David was notified by the real estate agent working with him on purchasing the Heathrow house that a new offer for the house had come in, and these people wanted to put the money down right away and buy the home. This news forced him to create a story to explain to Jayne why they wouldn't be moving to Heathrow any longer. By then, Jayne had begun to wonder if her father was right and she had moved too quickly in marrying him. Now David stood in front of her with news from the real estate agent when Jayne believed the deal had finally gone through. He apologized to her but said that the house was built over some dried-up swampland. The broker had just found out, he said. Developers came along and filled in a dried-up swamp and built houses on it, he told her. And sometimes that works out okay, but other times there's a danger that the swamp could fill up again during the rain. So he said it could be very dangerous. He had to give up on the house.
Right. That's a shame, isn't it?
It is. And this is, the first one, so maybe it's a little believable this time.
Yeah, but it's not the last time.
Absolutely not.
So Jayne was shocked and frustrated, but David seemed to have all the answers to her questions. She had already spent more than a month in a tiny apartment, and she had been desperately ready to move into their new house. Now they would have to start all over again searching for a place.
So that weekend, David and Jayne found a real estate agent who showed them several beautiful homes, including one that was even larger than the house in Heathrow. The house was 30 years old, and it had 10 acres of property situated along a peaceful pond in the Lake Mary Woods area. As he'd done before, David began working out a deal with the agent, assuring him that he would pay for the house in cash. But then, by Sunday night, he had changed his mind, and another offer was accepted on that house. So Jayne still believed he was a millionaire, but in reality, he didn't have enough money to buy any house, let alone a luxury home on a lake. How long could he keep making up offers on homes and allowing the deals to fall through? She's going to figure it out eventually, so the walls were really closing in.
That same week, Dorothy received the credit card statements that David had been trying to keep from her. And that's where she saw the charges for furniture, a cruise, women's clothing, and expensive restaurants.
Yeah, so he's kind of pushed his relationship with Dorothy aside, and now he's using his credit to make Jayne happy, and Dorothy's starting to figure out that something's wrong. Back in Orlando, David was spending his time house hunting with Jayne, and on Monday morning he flew to Pennsylvania to see Dorothy. Jayne wasn't happy about his travel plans, but David had convinced her that as the new man on staff at Disney, he had no choice but to go on this trip. So he took a cash advance from one of his credit cards and bought himself a ticket to Pennsylvania, because he really felt like he needed to go and check in with Dorothy. And on the trip, David came up with a plan. He knew that by then Dorothy would know about the credit cards, but he'd been very careful about what he'd charged. He'd only charged a few airline tickets, and otherwise he always took out cash advances to pay for his flights. He felt like that way no one could track his whereabouts by looking at the credit card statements. He decided he'd tell Dorothy that his cards had been stolen. He would promise to call the companies immediately to report the loss and get the charges removed from their account. And that way he'd buy himself another month before the next statement arrived, and then he'd have to deal with that.
You get the sense that his house of cards is starting to fall apart.
It really is, because he hadn't used credit before, and I think as long as he had a certain amount of money, he could pull off some things. But yeah, he's not doing well now.
No, he certainly isn't. David's business was falling apart, and he was hopelessly in debt. Then one day he snapped at Jayne, telling her that he was sick of her complaining. Jayne was so taken aback by this that she locked herself in her bedroom and called her friend Jody. Jody didn't know what to tell her. She had doubted Jayne's choice of marrying David so quickly, but she told Jayne that David was probably just stressed.
Well, yes, I'm sure she didn't want to tell her friend I told you so. She's just trying to be someone that she could talk to.
But she's thinking in her head, I told you so.
I would bet that she is. David flew to Los Angeles and closed his lobbying business the next morning. When he was finished at his office, he drove to the Chamber of Commerce and he resigned. After that, he drove to the house in Granada Hills and packed up the few remaining belongings that he had there. And when he was finished, he drove to the airport and bought himself a ticket back to Florida. This was the last time anyone in Los Angeles ever saw David Miller. Jayne didn't hear from him for 4 days. She'd talked things over with her friend Jody, and she'd agreed that David needed to be more considerate. Jayne was just so disappointed she didn't know if she could talk without losing her temper and bursting into tears. Jayne hoped David might come home from work by 5 o'clock each day and have dinner together like, a normal couple. Then they could spend the weekends decorating their house, hanging curtains, and doing gardening. She planned to talk to David as soon as he got home about their house hunting. But I think David had totally different ideas about, what was a normal life or life that he would enjoy.
Oh, absolutely. When David came home, he was excited and scooped her up in his arms. He told her that he had a surprise for her. The officials in Kuwait wanted to meet them in Europe, and they would leave for the trip that week. The credit cards still had room to charge the vacation, and by telling Jayne and her family that Kuwait was paying for the trip, he would become even more important in their eyes. The worse off his financial situation became, the worse he thought of himself, and the more necessary it became to convince his wives of his worth. But now Jayne wasn't even acting interested. She was no longer impressed by the money he spent, which, of course, would make David frustrated and angry.
Well, yeah, I'm sure she's beginning to see through some of his fake persona. So Jayne did contact her parents and her sister and her son Michael and told them about this change in plans about the trip to Europe. Surprisingly, they were all able to go despite that short notice. And that Monday morning, they made arrangements to get passports. And that afternoon, Jayne and David contacted their broker and continued their search for a house. This time, the broker showed them a bunch of impressive houses in the countryside, right outside the city of Orlando. The homes were all nestled in acres of trees, and Jayne fell in love with all of them. The homes were new, and all had been sold but one, so the broker took them inside that one, and Jayne was clearly impressed right away. There was a screened-in patio with a built-in pool and a barbecue area, and acres of green lawns behind the house. They spent the next hour filling out paperwork, and by the next day, they heard that their offer had been accepted. They would just need to put $5,000 down to hold the house until David could clear the funds from his investment account to pay the rest. David knew he couldn't cancel the deal too quickly, but he also knew there was no way he was going to buy that house. He had to take an advance on another credit card to pay the $5,000.
It seems like every time he turns around, he's got to be using those credit cards.
Yeah, I think that's what really started the downfall financially.
He's just not as liquid as he used to be.
Oh, not at all. He's really kind of broke.
Desperate times. So back at their apartment, Jayne was busy packing for the Europe trip. She had been wondering if David's interest in buying a house was a charade. He had already canceled the deals on 2 perfect houses. Now David showed her the receipt for the $5,000 deposit, and Jayne was thrilled.
I just need to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you need to see the receipt, then there's a trust issue in the relationship. Once you start asking for receipts, that's when you know trouble has begun.
Or is ongoing.
Yeah, right.
So Jayne would be going to Europe, and when she returned, she would be moving into her dream house.
Well, they're all the houses of her dream. I think she'd be happy just to get one nice, decent home. But Jayne's father, Richard, doubted David, and he was even more skeptical after he talked with him about their upcoming trip to Europe. At Jayne's request, David had called Richard, told him about the business trip, and asked him to bring Jayne and the others to the airport that Wednesday morning, where they would meet, and then together they would board a plane bound for Europe. Jayne had mentioned months ago that the government of Kuwait was paying for this trip. But when they'd been unable to find any proof that David was in fact an attorney, Richard decided that the idea of government officials in Kuwait paying for the trip had likely been a lie. David was probably paying for the trip out of his own money, but Richard didn't know that David really didn't have any money either. So when Jayne and the family met David at the airport, he handed each of them a boarding pass that was stamped with the round-trip ticket price for them to fly to France, Spain, Italy, and then back to Orlando. The price was marked on the bottom of each ticket, and that was $1,600. After they arrived in France, David set Jayne and her family up in a nice hotel near the Eiffel Tower. And for 3 days they stayed in France, and each day David continued to talk about his friend Nasir from Kuwait and his plans to meet up with him. But every time they went to meet Nasir, he didn't show up. And finally, David walked into their adjoining hotel room one afternoon and announced that there'd been a change in their plans. Nasir would be free to meet them in 2 days in Rome. David and his family would spend the next 2 days in France, and then they would fly to Rome, where Nasir would meet them at the airport.
So when the group left for Rome, they had 3 rooms at the Excelsior Hotel. Pretty nice place. David had promised Jayne and her family that Nasir would be treating them to fancy meals and expensive tours throughout the city. When he hadn't showed up in France, David had paid for the group's expenses, assuring them that Nasir would reimburse him when they met up with him. But now they were in Rome, and Nasir had still not arrived. So Jayne's family was beginning to make secret jokes about the mysterious Nasir, about whether he really existed or didn't exist. Finally, after 4 days of waiting for Nasir to meet them in Rome, David decided that they would have to go on to Spain.
Yeah, I don't understand why he was doing all this. There was no Nasir, clearly.
Other than being able to portray himself to his in-laws as a wealthy guy, this is a flimsy trip.
Well, it was a very high-class trip, though. Everything was first class.
Well, yeah.
They arrived in Barcelona and stayed at another luxury hotel. And throughout the trip, David used his credit cards to pay for everything. And he always assured Jayne and her family that Nasir would reimburse him as soon as they finally met up. But then by Wednesday night, when they'd been in Europe for nearly 2 weeks, David was in trouble. He treated everyone to a $200 dinner, and when the bill came, he pulled out a Visa card. 5 minutes later, the waitress returned and told David that the manager needed to see him. So that's a bad sign.
Yeah, not good.
The manager confronted David about his credit being overextended and his payments being past due. And of course, David acted shocked and angry at the bank's mistake. But he really was caught. So David walked slowly back to the table, and there really seemed no way out for him but to borrow money from Jayne's father. So he pulled Richard aside and explained that apparently the bank had confused his account with another cardholder's and the restaurant had declined his card. He would need cash to pay for the meal, he explained, but he would pay the money back as soon as they got home and he had a chance to clear up the situation with his bank. Well, of course, Richard didn't believe David's story, but, he hadn't spent any of his own money on the trip until that point, so he really couldn't refuse to pay for the dinner. He pulled out his wallet and paid the bill with his traveler's checks. You might even argue that Richard should have offered to pay for one of the meals.
Well, you certainly could.
Although David seems to say this is all on the Kuwaiti government, so we can spend all we want.
Okay, yeah.
So that night, back in their hotel room, David tried to lie his way out of this situation. But Jayne wasn't stupid, and she could no longer ignore David's lies. They argued, and then David went out and got drunk. When he came back, he was just tired, and he decided that he would tell Jayne some of the truth. But Jayne didn't take his admissions well. She called him a fraud, and he pushed her to the floor. David had never touched her before during one of their arguments, and Jayne was quite shocked. She told him if he touched her again, she would call the police. In the other room, Richard woke up and got out of bed. He had never heard Jayne so upset, and he wanted to make sure she was okay. So Richard knocked on their door, but when no one answered, he opened it and looked inside. David was there, and David stormed across the room, pushing Richard aside, and grabbed the doorknob. Then he yanked the door from its hinges and threw it to the floor. He stomped past Richard and down the hallway.
Whoa.
So he's really lost it now. For the next 30 minutes or so, Jayne told her father that David had lied about Nasir and the government of Kuwait paying for their trip. Richard wasn't surprised, but he knew that his daughter was. Richard told Jayne that he worried about her being with David. There was something about him that was growing concerning. Now it was more than lies, it was violence.
But Jayne still wanted her marriage to work, and Richard supported her in that. But he told her that David had to come clean about everything. But David didn't return to the room until the next afternoon. By then he was sober and very sorry. By the time they arrived back in Orlando, David wondered how he was going to save either of his marriages. He did want to stay married to both Dorothy and Jayne, and believed that he was trying his best to make them happy. It's tough to say with a straight face.
There's something seriously wrong with this person.
You think?
Yes, absolutely. But things got worse for Jayne 2 days after they got back home. Remember, she'd been anxious to move into their new house, and she'd been asking David questions about when the sale would be complete. Then David got a call from the real estate broker. He had taken it upon himself while they were gone to run a credit check on David through one of the local banks. And this report showed that David was deeply in debt and late on all of his payments. When the developer learned about David's credit problems, he decided that if David was unable to pay for the house in full by the very next day, his $5,000 deposit would be returned and the house would go back on the market. So there was no way he could pay for the house without a mortgage, and the news about his credit meant that no one was going to loan him the money. So he said to the real estate agent, "Put it back on the market and I'll have my refund ready in an hour." He pretended to be insulted, of course, and said, "We'll just find another house." But of course, when Jayne heard about this, she was beyond disappointed. This time she was angry. The next day she talked to her friend Jody, and she wondered aloud why her husband kept making offers on homes and then letting the deals fall through. So Jody suggested, "Well, maybe he's just not a millionaire, Jayne." But Jayne thought, well, he has to be a millionaire. How else could he have paid for all those luxury trips? But then by the end of May, something happened that finally convinced Jayne that her husband really wasn't wealthy. Jayne received a phone call from the storage unit where they'd been storing their furniture. The furniture had been picked up by the furniture store. David had arranged for this and asked for a refund, telling the store he couldn't afford to make the payments. David went back to see Dorothy, and remarkably, she believed his stories and stood by him. When David flew from Pittsburgh to Orlando, he refused to think about Dorothy's reaction when she discovered she no longer had any money, because he had withdrawn the last $2,000 from their joint personal account and closed it out before he left. So it really screwed Dorothy over.
Yes, he did. So now David's concentrating on ways he could make Jayne happy. Then Dorothy found out about the money 2 days later. Dorothy had been to the supermarket, bought enough groceries for 2 weeks. Later she had gone shopping, picked up some clothing for the boys, and even purchased a few dresses for herself before returning home that afternoon. She paid for all her purchases with a check, and the bank called her 2 days later and told her that 4 checks written by her had been returned for insufficient funds. And Dorothy was sitting there going, "What?"
What a horrible feeling.
Absolutely. So Dorothy decided that her husband's involvement with the CIA must have been behind his withdrawing all the money. Even though David had told her never to contact his office, this was an emergency. She had to talk to him immediately. She picked up the phone, called information, and asked for the number of the CIA office in Orlando. That's when she found out the closest CIA office was in Miami.
Whoops.
So this is confusing to Dorothy.
I bet.
And after they left Los Angeles, David had told her his office was in Orlando. But maybe David had lied about the office location as a way of protecting her and the children. So Dorothy seems to be really good at justifying her husband's behaviors, as strange as they might be.
Right, and this whole CIA thing seems to be the excuse for everything. So he's really taken that to the limit. But then Dorothy's old neighbors called her and asked her if David was seeing another woman. They had seen him at their old house with another woman, and he had his arm around this blonde woman, and the neighbor wondered if Dorothy and David had separated. But, of course, Dorothy didn't believe this. Whatever was happening with David, she believed that he could explain it when he got home. There had to be a good reason.
She was nearly convinced that everything would be explained when she went out to get the mail that same day. However, in the mail was a letter from the Central Intelligence Agency office in Washington, D.C. She had been expecting a reply to an inquiry she had made trying to locate him. She opened the envelope and scanned the page. The office had written to notify Dorothy that David Miller did not work for the CIA now and never had worked for the agency. The responding agent thanked her for her inquiry and apologized for being unable to help in her search for her husband. The last line read, "Apparently, you are married to a con man." Wow. Dorothy could no longer make excuses for her husband.
Right. So it seems like at this point he was moving Jayne into his old house that he had shared with Dorothy in Florida. And he's got Dorothy up there in Pennsylvania with no money. She's got the kids, no job, and no money. So even though Jayne now had serious doubts about her husband, she still loved David, but she did doubt his job at Disney. She had been in his office and seen his desk, and it had his name and it had a picture of her sitting there, but she hadn't seen any of his paychecks ever. So until recently she'd believed him, but now she's having these doubts and she wanted to find out for herself. So she's decided to become a little proactive, which is good. She called her sister, and her sister always had good advice, and she knew that she could find out if David was lying about the job at Disney. So her sister suggested that Jayne call the bank and check if the funds from Disney had been deposited. So that sounded simple. And Jayne made the call and learned that whatever money David was depositing into their checking account was not coming from Disney. The little money that he had was from lobbying work he'd done in Florida. So Jayne called her sister back and told her this news. Then her sister called Disney, and she was able to confirm that he did not and never had worked there. So that evening when David came home, Jayne knew the truth, and after finding out about his job at Disney, she was pretty sure that she no longer wanted to be married to this guy. She narrowed her eyes at him and refused to let him touch her. And right away she told him that she knew the truth. At first he thought she was maybe talking about his other marriage, his marriage to Dorothy. But when David realized that Jayne was upset about his made-up Disney job, he got pretty calm. He thought, well, I can get through this.
Yeah, I can handle this one.
Right. So he had long ago actually come up with an explanation in case she did check up on him at Disney. And he said, well, of course I don't actually work for Disney. I'm an independent contractor, and Disney uses my services regularly. So I don't know why you would fall for this, but David was impressive with the lies, I guess. He was able to talk himself out of this, too. He persisted with the independent contractor idea and told her that he wanted them to move into his old house. Now, she didn't know he'd shared this with Dorothy, but that's the house. That's the house where the neighbors saw him with Jayne and called Dorothy. So when he took Jayne to see the house, he thought that the neighbors who knew Dorothy and him very well would be away on vacation, because they normally spent the month of June and some of July visiting their family in other parts of the country. So they pulled up in front of the house, and David got out and opened Jayne's door. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her in for a long, passionate kiss. And that's when the neighbors saw him, and he saw them looking right at him and Jayne. So after this, David became really paranoid. He couldn't imagine losing both of his wives, and now he's thinking he could even go to jail. So David began doing more and more careless things. he began to spend time with other women in the Orlando area, especially this woman named Hilda, who owned her own business. He knew Hilda from past business trips, and after having lunch with her one day, he began spending his afternoons with her. So he's really losing it.
He is. Definitely wasn't operating as smoothly as he once had. Then in early July, he went to a local gun shop and bought several weapons, including a semi-automatic rifle. Once the guns were loaded and hidden in the trunk of his car, he must have decided that he would do whatever was necessary to persuade his wives to keep quiet about his being a bigamist. I don't know how he's going to do that.
No, I don't think he was thinking straight anymore.
Of course, there was still the possibility that they didn't know about each other and never would. But David bought the guns because he was no longer willing to take a chance. He would defend his double life, no matter what he had to do.
And there's no way we can tell exactly what was going through his head, but things really were off. Then there was an incident between him and Jayne soon after this that made Jayne even more afraid of David. Unlike David, her fear had nothing to do with her reputation or legal issues. She was actually now afraid for her own life.
David couldn't move Jayne into his old house, so he told her that the renters refused to move out. And Jayne's incredulous with this news. She was tired of being lied to and told him that she was leaving him. She packed her bags and was planning to go stay with her grandmother. But when she went to put her suitcase in the trunk, she saw David's bag of guns. He had sobbed, begging her to stay. But when she went back into the apartment to ask about the guns, he was calmly watching TV. Jayne had just learned that she was pregnant, but she decided not to tell David. She's going to raise this child on her own.
Yeah, so that night, though, David went to Jayne's grandmother's house where she was staying, and Jayne's son answered the door, and David pushed past him. Jayne told him to leave and threatened to call the police, and that enraged him, and he put his hands around her throat, strangling her. Michael tried to get David off of his mother, and he called the police. When David heard him making the call, he seemed to come to his senses, and he went out to his car and drove away quickly. So by the time the police got there, David was gone. Jayne filed a report charging David with domestic violence, but for some reason she refused to get a restraining order. She told her son, though, that it was over with David. But later that night, after Michael went back to his father's house, David came back. Jayne had told herself that if David came back, she'd bolt the door and refuse to talk to him. But for some reason, Jayne wanted David to see how badly he'd hurt her. She opened the door a few inches and said, "Look what you did." Then she told him to leave, but he was able to push her aside and shove her to the floor. So now Jayne was terrified. There was no one there to call the police for her, and David was even angrier than he'd been before. David dragged Jayne toward the closet and ordered her to get inside. Then he slammed the door shut and locked it. For the next hour he yelled at her, blaming her for everything. And she didn't know what he was going to do. He could have set the house on fire and left her there.
Yeah, he's definitely lost it.
Absolutely, yes.
So Jayne listened as David finally walked out of the kitchen and left the house. She heard a car door slam and then the sound of squealing tires as he drove away. She was able to unlock the door from the inside. She looked at her watch in shock, realizing that she had spent 4 hours in the closet. She finally knew that there would be no reconciliation with David. She called her friend Jody in Los Angeles and told her that she was finally really done with him. Later that night, she miscarried her pregnancy.
So Dorothy didn't hear from David for a month, and then he called her on July 5th. She confronted him with all of his lies and told him that she was going ahead with a divorce. So he called her back the next 2 nights and threatened to kill her. She recorded these calls and gave the tape to the police. Jayne should have been concerned for her own safety, but she was still worried about David. She did feel betrayed by his lies and his violence, but still, she wondered where he was and what was happening to him. By mid-July, she was no longer afraid of him. She believed that she and David still loved each other. She decided that he was struggling to accept that he couldn't give her everything he had promised. His financial situation was so bad that Jayne had contacted the apartment owner, and she'd learned that they were being evicted from the apartment, too. David had already moved out, and the landlord hadn't seen him since July 1st. After that, Jayne had moved their belongings into her father's storage unit at the U Storage place in Orlando. So she wondered where David had gone and how he would react when he realized that his belongings had been moved. And I just think she should have been giving a lot less thought to David and more thought to herself. But Jayne started talking with David when he called her next. Then she agreed to see him if he turned over his guns to her father. So David agreed, and he gave Richard 3 guns. But what Richard and Jayne didn't know is David had kept his 9mm for himself. Of course, Richard didn't know how many guns David had actually owned, so how would he know?
Well, he wouldn't. So Jayne and David actually began spending more and more time together. She didn't tell her friends and family members about this because she knew what they were going to tell her. But David had not come completely clean with Jayne. She still didn't know that he had married her while he was still married to Dorothy, for one thing.
That's one big thing.
Just a big thing.
Yes.
In late August, David told Jayne that he was going away on a 1-week business trip. But just 2 days later, while out with his sister, Jayne saw David driving in town. He looked at her, stone-faced and glaring. She got chills and believed he really did want to kill her. So she hired a private investigator to see what David was really up to.
Yeah, and that's how Jayne learned that David had been married to her and Dorothy at the same time. So she went to see an attorney and apply for an annulment. David really just couldn't stand the idea that his bigamy would be made public. If the police or the press found out about the fact that he had 2 wives, he would be finished. He had no intention of letting that happen, and he was still keeping his loaded 9mm with him everywhere he went. Then on September 11th, Jayne called Dorothy, and they spoke to each other for over an hour. They agreed that they were both victims of a very self-centered con man, and before they hung up, Jayne found out that David had been visiting Dorothy when he had told her he was going to Los Angeles on business. She also learned that he had left Dorothy in debt and taken all the cash from their checking account. That same night, Jayne spoke with Dorothy again and the private investigator. She told both of them that she was moving to Los Angeles on Tuesday, but that first she was going to take David's things out of her father's storage unit and give them back to him. Now they were both very concerned for her safety. They knew that David would be feeling trapped and desperate. So they offered her the same warning that her mother would offer her: stay away from David because he could be dangerous. By September 15th, 1991, fear of being caught was consuming David's thoughts, so they were right about that. That morning, after hearing Jayne's message that she left to pick up his belongings, he knew that she could destroy him, and by his twisted standards, he felt he'd been a good husband to Jayne. Yes, he would concede that he did have 2 wives, but he felt that he was kind and faithful to each wife in his own way, right?
By that morning, David had made the decision to eliminate Jayne, not just from his life, but from life itself.
Yeah, he really had, and he waited until that afternoon and then got in his car, and he had the loaded 9mm with him. So he started up the engine and began driving to the storage unit. Remember, Jayne had left her parents' home driving her red Hyundai sometime after noon. She stopped at a convenience store for a wine cooler, then drove to the U Storage on Orlando Drive. She parked in front of her father's storage unit, which was number 18. And for the next hour or so, Jayne went through David's belongings, putting boxes outside of the unit. When she had removed everything that belonged to him, she returned to her car and opened up the wine cooler. It was a hot, humid day, and the drink was very refreshing. It was kind of her reward for her work. So she was sipping on it, hoping it would calm her nerves as she waited. At 10 o'clock that morning, David had worked out a financial arrangement with 2 co-workers, Jeremy and Jay, who would meet him at the U Storage to help move his belongings. The 2 agreed to meet at the storage unit around 3 that afternoon.
At 2:45 p.m., Orlando man Jason Herget pulled up next to Jayne's car in front of Unit 17 at the U Storage on Orlando Drive. He had a list of things to do that Sunday afternoon. One was to go through his belongings and locate some documents that he had in storage. As he climbed out of his car, he noticed a pretty blonde woman in shorts and a t-shirt sitting on the car beside him. She was reading a book and drinking a wine cooler. Then he said hello to her. Jason had never seen Jayne before. She was obviously attractive, but she looked sad. He asked her if she was moving, and she told him she was waiting for her husband to come and get his things. She was leaving him. Jason looked at his watch. He hesitated before turning away and said to her, Hey, you be careful, okay? Jayne nodded as Jason went into his storage unit.
Yeah, so at 3 p.m., Jayne was sitting on the hood of her car when David pulled up about 40 feet away. He climbed out and began loading boxes, and Jayne watched him in disgust. When it became obvious that he wasn't even going to talk to her, she said, "You're such a jerk, David." Then the two began to argue, and David called Jayne a witch. Jayne climbed off the car and moved closer to David. She told him that she would be pressing charges against him, and she'd be going to the media as well. Then Jayne stepped back, proud of herself for telling him off. But David was very angry. Instead of crying or backing away from her, he moved closer. He screamed at her then, swearing and name-calling and blaming her for destroying his life. As he continued to yell, Jayne began to feel afraid of David. She'd not expected him to react like this, so she turned around and headed for her car. Meanwhile, Jason Herget had been trying to ignore the fighting going on just outside of his storage unit. He heard the woman shout something about another wife, and then the man seemed to lose control. The man seemed very unstable to Jason, and he didn't want anything to happen to the pretty blonde woman. He listened as she shut her car door, but instead of driving away, she was continuing to argue with her husband. Then at 3:25 p.m., co-workers Jeremy and Jay pulled up near Unit 18 to help David with his belongings. When they heard David and his wife arguing, they just walked toward the stack of boxes and didn't say anything. They'd taken one load of boxes to the cars when they saw David reach into Jayne's car and hit her on the face. Jayne's head snapped backward, he'd hit her so hard, and she began to cry, and she was bleeding from her nose. So Jayne opened her car door and fell to her knees on the hot pavement. She was sobbing and wiping the blood from her face. David then moved back several feet and watched as she struggled to get to her feet. Then Jayne yelled at him that she was calling the police. Well, then David walked back to his car, leaned into the passenger side, and pulled out his gun. Jason Herget could hear her crying, and he looked around the corner and saw that her husband was returning to his car. So Jason thought, oh, thanks, he's finally leaving. But then he saw David reach into his car and grab a gun. David walked quickly toward Jayne with the gun in his hand, and Jayne was in her car trying to get away, putting her car in reverse. So for a few seconds, David stood staring at his wife through the driver's side window. Then he turned and stared cold-bloodedly at Jason. Before Jason could even react, David turned again towards Jayne and pulled the trigger 6 times.
Co-workers Jeremy and Jay watched in horror as David stared at his wife and began to shoot her through the car window. He showed no emotion, and when he finally stopped, he walked slowly around her car toward the passenger side. He raised the gun again and aimed it at Jayne's slumped-over body and shot her one final time. Jeremy could not believe what was happening. He moved behind the cars and came up behind David and snatched the gun from his hand.
That's very brave.
That's pretty bold.
It really is.
David turned, looked vacantly at Jeremy, and wandered away from the unit around a corner. Still holding the gun, Jeremy raced toward his car. Using the vehicle's dispatch system, he called 911. Then he put the gun inside his car and ran to Jayne. Jason Herget heard someone calling the police and decided it was safe for him to come out. He saw that a man was already heading for the woman's car and that her husband was gone. No longer fearing for his safety, he ran to the woman. Jason moved in and began to remove pieces of the car window from Jayne's bleeding body. He reached for Jayne's wrist and felt for a pulse. It was weak, but steady, and he could hear Jayne gasping for air.
Jayne clearly needed CPR, but a bullet had entered her cheek, leaving her face unrecognizable. So CPR was just impossible. The men struggled to get her into a sitting position, and they tilted her head back to clear her airway. As they did, she made 2 wet gasps, struggling for air, and then suddenly she was silent. Jayne had a gaping hole in her shoulder as well as the one in her cheek, and her chest looked like a mass of just shredded flesh. She had been hit by each of the 7 bullets that David had fired. As the 3 men waited for an ambulance, David leaned around the corner and asked, "Is she dead or what?" Then sirens could be heard in the distance, and David disappeared again around the corner. When he'd heard the sound of gunfire, the used store manager closed the front gates and locked them. Whoever had fired the shots would have no way out except through those front gates. So the manager stopped David as he approached the exit. David stared blankly and said, "My wife has been shot." He watched as the police entered with their guns drawn, and when they got David face down on the ground, they handcuffed him and took him into custody. Paramedics meanwhile worked on Jayne for several minutes, but there was clearly no way they were going to be able to save her.
By 10 that night, Jayne's entire family had gathered at her parents' house. They were all heartbroken and in shock. It was the private investigator who called and notified Dorothy about what had happened. The man she had married, the man she had lived with and trusted completely, had murdered someone. He was worse than a liar and a con man. He was a killer. Dorothy was haunted by two thoughts. First, that her daughter Katie had been right about David all along. And second, it could have been her.
Absolutely, it could have been her. I mean, she's very lucky. If he would kill Jayne, there's no reason why he wouldn't kill Dorothy.
So David's parents hired a defense attorney. By Florida standards, a person is considered temporarily insane for criminal purposes if they meet 3 qualifications. They must not know what they are doing at the time of the crime. They must not understand the consequences of what they're doing. And they must not know what they're doing is wrong. That's going to be David's defense, temporary insanity.
Yeah, so for that, David had to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. The first time the doctor examined David, he identified 2 disorders. First, David had depression. Second, he had narcissistic personality disorder. But none of that would be enough to prove David had been temporarily insane at the time of Jayne's murder. David's case had grown out of his depressant disorder. And by medical definition, depression can, in rare cases, lead to a dissociation. When this happens, the mind separates and compartmentalizes events so that they occur only in a portion of the mind. So the psychiatrist believed that this had happened to David in the moments before he shot and killed Jayne. And if it had, David would have met all 3 qualifications for the legal definition of being temporarily insane. He would not have known what he was doing or the consequences of his actions or whether his actions were right or wrong. So this doctor based his opinion on one simple detail. Not only did David not remember any of the details of Jayne's murder, he also said he didn't remember being married to Dorothy at all. So knowing what they were up against, the prosecution contacted 3 psychiatrists to interview David and to prove that David had been sane. While marrying 2 wives and leading a double life was not something a mentally healthy person would do, David had purposefully killed Jayne before she could expose his double life and his bigamy. The defense tried to arrange a plea bargain in which David would be found guilty of 3rd-degree murder. In Florida, this type of agreement must be worked out between the defense, the state, and the victim's family, and Janice and Richard Leebrick would not even consider this deal. I would think with 3rd-degree murder, he may have gotten just a few years in jail.
Yeah, just a slap on the wrist.
It seems very premeditated, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. So David waited for the outcome in his case in the John E. Polk Correctional Facility in Sanford. He was on suicide watch, and whenever he spoke with his attorney, he seemed to accept the fact that he would be serving time for killing his wife. As the trial date grew near, Dorothy was in constant contact with the prosecutor also. Dorothy wanted to be sure that the case included David's bigamy, even though they might not be able to bring it up at trial. So jury selection began Monday, December 7th. The defense had hoped to fill the jury with men who might be able to relate to David more.
I don't see that because the men in the jury aren't going to be bigamists or murderers.
Probably not.
Yeah, anyway.
But in the end, the jury had more women than men. The trial began December 9th.
So testimony about David's bigamy was allowed. And this was an important decision for the prosecution because Jayne and David had been arguing about her reporting his bigamy to the police. And Dorothy was also called to testify about this. By the afternoon of December 12th, the prosecution rested. And as expected, the entire defense was built around the psychiatrist's testimony. He took the stand and testified about David's mental problems, including his narcissistic behavior and his depression, which had led to a split personality and a memory blackout involving the murder. So he was, the psychiatrist concluded, legally insane at the time of the murder. But the doctors for the prosecution took the stand 2 days later, and each of the 3 doctors testified that, after examining David, they had determined him to be depressed but sane during the murder.
So whose experts do you believe, right? That's what the jury's asked.
Pretty much, but I really think this was a Hail Mary for the defense. to say he didn't remember being married to Dorothy, and there's no evidence of that. I just think you could probably hire a psychiatrist to tell you anything you wanted to hear for your defense.
Well, you can. I mean, it's not just this particular case.
No.
Any case where there's expert testimony.
You can get an expert to take your side.
Right.
So closing arguments were made the next day. The defense painted the picture of a desperate man who'd been in over his head, both personally and financially. When Jayne told him she was leaving him for good, he snapped. They also argued that any man who would be married to 2 women at the same time had to be insane, which is a piss-poor argument if you ask me.
Well,
I'm not impressed.
When you got nothing, that's what you come up with.
That's true. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Jayne was killed the day before she intended to press bigamy charges against her husband. She talked about David's self-centered behavior and how callous he had been. Then she refreshed the jury on the definition of first-degree murder. Because if David even thought about killing Jayne as he was retrieving the gun from his car, that would be premeditation. So the jury deliberated for just 3 hours, and we know that's a bad sign for the defense.
Usually it is.
He was found guilty, and at sentencing, David Miller got life in prison. He would be eligible for parole after 25 years, but when released, he would also serve 15 years probation. But he has not gotten out of prison. He remains in prison, even though those 25 years have long since passed.
Yeah, the parole hasn't occurred, has it?
No, I don't know if he'll ever get parole. He's kind of an older guy now,
It's
you know?
It's going to be difficult.
Yeah, but these double life stories always get me. How people think they can pull this off, and just the stress you would be living under. And the people you would hurt. I mean, that's a big thing too.
Yeah.
Why do that to a person? Certainly something wrong with his whole thinking process. And, I would even say sociopath, although I'm not a psychiatrist. I see definite signs of sociopathy, or even psychopathy.
Yeah, he's got something missing up there.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's time for listener feedback.
Okay, well, let's do some feedback. How's that?
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to play a voicemail from Justin with a case suggestion.
I have a couple case suggestions. I have the one about Rhonda Reynolds. She was a former Washington State Patrol who was going to go home to see her mom the day before Christmas. And the day after, she was found dead in a closet. I have a beer suggestion of Danger Dan's Lager by Dick's Brewery in Centralia, Washington. I also have another case suggestion of Dawn Hackney, who died in a fire the day after Christmas. And allegedly her husband, Nick Hackney, was innocent and later found to be guilty. I have another beer suggestion of Dick's Cream Stout, which is also part of the Dick's Brewery in Centralia, Washington.
Okay, so 2 case suggestions actually from Justin, and sounds like Justin was on the highway, pulled over on the highway.
It sounds like he was pulled over and cars were passing him.
Yeah, it really did, yeah. So I tried to help the audio out a little bit there, but it's not terrible. You could understand him.
So as Justin said, Rhonda Reynolds was a former Washington State trooper who died of a gunshot wound to her head. Her death was ruled a suicide, but her mother, Barb Thompson, spent the next 13 years challenging that finding. And in 2011, a jury ruled that Reynolds had been murdered and her husband and stepson were responsible. Now, Ann Rule has written a book about this case titled In the Still of the Night. I think we'll look into doing that one.
Yeah, I wonder if Ann knew Rhonda, because Ann was a policewoman for quite a while.
Might have.
Yeah, so she might have actually known her. But yeah, that's a fascinating case, so definitely. The other case was Dawn Hackney, and there's actually an accident, suicide, or murder case about this one. So she was a pastor's wife who was found dead in her bed after a fire. And the curious thing was she hadn't tried to move or get out of the fire. So it was the day after Christmas in 1997 when a 911 call came into the Bremerton Fire Department in Washington, reporting a fire at the home of Nick Hackney, who was a young pastor at the Evangelical Christ Community Church on Bainbridge Island, that's just across from Puget Sound. So after subduing the blaze, they found the badly burned body of his 28-year-old wife, Dawn, lying dead in their bed. So Nick was apparently out hunting at the time of the fire, and although he did seem distraught after hearing about his wife's death, he did seem to bounce back pretty quickly. He started seeing new women pretty much at once, and in fact some of them he had been seeing while his wife was still alive. So people began to think, oh, maybe Dawn's death was not an accident. So Nick was someone who often counseled other young couples, and before Dawn's death, he'd found himself immersed in some deep emotional relationships with 3 women in this church. And these relationships became physical, of course. He told one woman that God had granted him special privileges to have sex with other women. So this sounds like quite a guy, quite a case. So I think, Justin, that both of your cases will be great to cover. Very good. And what about the beers? Have you tried either of those beers?
I have not tried either of those beers.
So we've got beers for them too. Thanks, Justin. Yeah. So our next case suggestion is from Hachiko, and that must be from YouTube.
This is a case involving a person named Robert Stephen Farley, who had been abducted from his high school classroom in 1991 by a man who impersonated a police officer. So this guy came into the classroom, flashed a badge, and said he was here for Robert Farley. And out they go. Now his body was found the next day. He had been stabbed with an ice pick and strangled. The murder seems to have been the result of jealousy. Michael Clark was a young man who was madly in love with Tracy Jarvis, but Tracy was engaged to Robert Farley.
Pretty young for that in high school.
Pretty young high school kids. When she told Michael Clark that she was betrothed to Robert Farley, Clark didn't take that too well. So he and his half-brother, Jerry Kiersey, abducted and killed Farley.
Wow, what a really senseless murder that was.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Horrible. Well, thank you for that. That's a great one, too. Then we have another case suggestion from at that Arab Girl 10. And this is for Johnny Gosh. And probably most people are familiar, but I'll go over it briefly. Johnny Gosh disappeared on September 5th, 1982, while delivering newspapers. He is presumed to have been kidnapped. As of 2023, no arrests have been made. The case is considered cold, but it's still an open case. Johnny's mother says she was visited by Johnny in 1997, and he told her he'd been kidnapped by a pedophile ring and had recently escaped. In 2006, his mother said someone had left pictures of Johnny while in captivity. Johnny was one of the first missing children whose picture was put on milk cartons. Then there were also 2 other cases that could potentially be linked to Johnny's disappearance. Eugene Martin disappeared in 1984 while delivering newspapers, and Mark Allen disappeared in 1986 while walking to a friend's house. So there are documentaries on Johnny Gosh. There's a book. It's actually a very interesting case, pretty complex, a lot to it. So it's definitely one that would be worth covering, although I'm sure it's been covered a lot. I think it would be, something to look into and talk about.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you so much for your case suggestions. I love the case suggestions. Please keep them coming.
Yeah, the more case suggestions, the better.
I think so.
I like to have choices.
Well, yeah, and I know probably not everyone listens to the feedback portion, but as I've said before, it's really one of my favorite parts of doing the podcast is hearing from people.
You can learn a lot.
You certainly can. I mean, our listeners know their true crime. I'll give them that.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So before we sign off for the day, a quick reminder about our premium option of TCB, where you can get early ad-free and bonus shows. We do a bonus case each month for subscribers, and we often throw in a recap or a discussion of a true crime show as well. We also send our new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you. And I just want to thank our recent members because we've had a lot of new members come on lately, and that's great. You can subscribe by going to tygraver.com/subscribe and get all TCB episodes early and ad-free. If you prefer, you can also get the same benefits by becoming a TCB patron at patreon.com/tiegrabber. Some other ways that we like to ask for help are for positive reviews on Apple Podcasts, and of course, your feedback. We love your feedback. And word of mouth. That's a great way to get us more listeners, is let your other true crime friends know that we're out here and we're working hard. So if you have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. You can also record a voicemail for the show by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website, tiegrabber.com. So thanks, guys, and we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Got a few seats saved for you.
All right. Maybe you can sit next to Santa.
Who knows?
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye.